I've been reading through a book of the Bible. And so I want to go through, I've been reading through the Bible, just kind of casually reading through. And as I was thinking about today and what we would talk about, we're kind of at that Sunday of Sundays when you start now seeing all the ads on internet and on TV of what's this next year going to look like? What New Year's resolution are you going to do? Anyone doing resolutions? Nobody over here. Anybody over here doing okay, nobody. Oh boy. But you get more advice this time of the year than you know what to do with. 13 things to do in 2013. You get things to stop doing, things to start doing, and you're probably a good swath of the demographic of our city and our country. Like, yeah, I gave up on resolutions. I resolved 50 years ago never to take another resolution. And so you're just kind of giving up. But this time of the year, everyone is pushing these out, and I saw several this last week, and I'm kind of laughing at them. But there are tremendous benefits to starting something new. Why do we start over again anyway? I mean, when you wake up on this, so you're going to be financially wise in 2013. Yay, does that mean all your debt's gone from 2012? No, you wake up and everything is the same. You just now have a new resolve to do something maybe just a little bit differently. And so you need a starting point. You need a place in the calendar at some point to say, I'm going to do something different. I remember Ira Gray used to say going to church on Sunday was like starting over. It was just a day of the week to go, today starts a new, fresh, calibrated day. It's new, it's different. I'm going to do something different. From now on, I'm going to change. And I think the Bible is wired us for this schedule. You know, I believe there are 7 different feasts in the Bible that God sets up for us to start over. For the Day of Atonement, the Passover, you have the Feast of Booths, the Feast of Tabernacles, and a few others that were there to kind of give the nation of Israel a holiday. To take time off, to rethink, to come back together again, and start afresh. And working through the Old Testament, I've landed in the book of Judges. If you'll take your Bible there and turn to the book of Judges, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, and then Judges. Judges is a book that kind of sees the nation of Israel on a new trajectory. They're entering into a new day, and they are embracing a new way of life and a new thing that God has for them. It's one of the most disturbing books in the Bible. Yay, and we're going to read about it today. We're going to look at this book just in a little synopsis of what the nation was experiencing and their new day and their new way of looking at life and how it was going to affect them day to day. It's a terrifying book in so many ways. It's cyclical. Have you ever been caught on that cycle of life where your life just seems like it's going around in a circle? Students, you know what it feels like. You just won't realize it until you get past it, but it goes spring semester, summer, fall semester, spring semester, summer. You see the cycle? Spring semester, summer, fall semester, and it just goes around. You do this for like 12 years of your life. It just goes like this. Summer always follows the spring semester. Wow, there's a pattern. Is that new? Did you guys I just blow your mind? Okay, and when you're senior adult, well, not senior adults, but when you're in the working world, it's Labor Day, Memorial Day, Christmas, Labor Day, Memorial Day, Christmas, 4th of July. It's this little cycle. But inside of the nation of Israel, it was so terrible because they would go from walking with God to rebelling against God, to being judged by God, to being delivered by God, to walking with God. It goes around like this, over and over and over again. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand, but have you ever experienced that cycle before? To where you walk with God, you rebel against God, then you're disciplined by God, and then you're redeemed or brought back to God through some kind of a crisis. And then that's the book of Judges. And when you read the book, you're just kind of going, man, what is going on with these people? How come they keep making the same mistake twice? And then you get up and look in the mirror. And you ask yourself the same question. Why am I making the same mistake twice? And so the book of Judges is very applicable to our day and to our culture and to our time. But there's a part of the book in the very beginning that kind of captures as an outline for the entirety of the book. Saying at the context, Joshua is a book of conquering. That generation there was the conquering generation. They came across the Jordan River, and that's where you get the Battle of Jericho. You get the battle against Ai. You get the battle against all the Canaanites. And they go to war and they conquer the land. It's the conquering generation. In our day, it might be called the greatest generation, the World War II generation, the generation that fought and maintained our freedom that we were so comfortable with prior to World War II. The greatest generation. And that's kind of like the book of Joshua. They fought so many battles and the land was divided up and they were all sent and dispatched to their parts of the land to where they could occupy it and enjoy God's blessing. What a great day. You fight all these battles and then you get to go rest. I'm a fan of that movie that was out several years ago, Band of Brothers. And it was very intriguing at the very end of that whole series. It shows where these men went. And most of them went and just enjoyed life. Away from conflict, away from war. And if you've read Flags of Our Fathers, that man in that book, Mr. Bradley, he never even talked about his experience. He just wanted to enjoy his freedom. And I get the feeling that when you read the book of Joshua and you read towards the end where they're given all of their land, these men who fought these wars just went and enjoyed their freedom. They were the conquering generation. They were the fighters. And a book concludes with Joshua, if you can just imagine, a 110-year-old general. In our day, he might have a real sharp hat, a breast full of medals, and a neat, snappy uniform standing up. And he says to the nation of Israel, who will you serve? Will you serve the gods of these nations that we have defeated, or will you serve the God of Israel? And then he says those great lines that you probably have heard. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And that was that generation. They were the conquering generation. They saw God do incredible things. And then they passed the baton off. And that's always the scary thing when you watch the Olympics and they're running that relay where they're passing the baton. It's one thing to run when you got a firm grasp on that baton. That's the easy part. It's when you have to hand it off to the next generation. That's when it's scary. And so in that scene at the end of the book of Joshua, in Joshua chapter 24, he's passing the baton off. And he's saying to the young generation, his kids, who will you serve? And of course, at that moment, they all say, we will serve the Lord. That's who we're going to serve. And look what happens inside the book of Judges. He kind of gives us a synopsis of that in chapter 2, verse 6. When Joshua had dismissed the people, he's given them the speech. He's dismissed them to possess the land. The people served the Lord all the days of Joshua. So his kids, they all served the Lord. And all the days of the elders who survived Joshua, so those who knew Joshua, who served with Joshua while they were living, everybody served the Lord. Those who had seen all the great work of the Lord which he had done for Israel. And then in verse 8 of chapter 2, then Joshua, the son of Nun, servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110. And they buried him in the territory of his inheritance, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gosh. All that generation also were gathered to their fathers. So here you have the transition. They've all died. They've all gone the way of the dinosaur. They've all passed away. And now's the question. Who is that new generation? The baton has been handed. How is that going to go? Into verse 10. And there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord, nor yet the work which he had done. They didn't know. They hadn't heard, they hadn't seen, they hadn't experienced. They received a baton, but they kind of look at it and go, I don't know all of this. What is this? Who did all of these things? We've not experienced this before. What's this all about? A generation that I would term the functional generation. They just did enough to get by. Perhaps they looked at the baton and went, yeah, that's really neat, but we got a pretty comfortable life. So we're just going to set that baton there and just look at it. We don't know any of those things firsthand. That was my grandfather who did that. I'm not really sure what all that is about. They functioned, and you can look back in chapter 1, and you can see how they functioned. And the words that pop out to me over and over again when you read chapter 1 is they did not, they did not, they did not. God told them to occupy the land, and they did not, and they did not, and they did not. They did not obey the Lord. They got to that place where they were just functioning. Now, how many of you all tried a remodeling project in 2012? Anyone try to remodel something, did you? You know the scariest part when you remodel something in your home? It's not the beginning. You know when you take that wall, that hammer, and you look at the wall and you knock it down? That's not the scary part. That's the fun part because you get to demo. Demo is fun. You don't have to have a lot of skill. When it comes to demo, you just have to have a lot of aggression. And so you just start throwing things at the wall and you start to break things, and it's a lot of fun. The most scariest, frightening part of any remodel project is when your room or your bathroom becomes functional. Not finished, but functional. It's when there's water that comes out of the kitchen, or when the oven and the stove work, but the floor's not done, the walls aren't painted, and the cabinets haven't been completed. It's functional, though, but it's not finished. Or the bathroom's functional, not finished, and then you get comfortable with it just being functional. Am I in your kitchen yet? You know where I'm talking? It's just comfortable. Yeah, there's a pile of something there, but we've learned to make a path around that pile. Or we've kind of stopped the vision. We've lost sight of what we were trying to do, and we're just going to get comfortable with that and not worry about it. It's functional, but it's not finished. And what happened to the nation of Israel is that their land was functional, but it wasn't finished. The conquering was functional, but not complete, and they stopped. And we've done that in our personal lives. I did a kitchen remodel in my house this last year. It's 90% done. It is going to take till 2015 to become 100% done. It's very, very functional. I just got to paint the ceiling, got to paint the door, and I've got to do a couple other little things, and then it'll be finished. It's going to take me 10 years to do that, though. The nation of Israel, they got to that point where, yeah, we're supposed to run those people out of our city, but we're tired. And so they get distracted. Their priorities become a little bit different. Perhaps they get to the point where there's like, yeah, but it's okay. God's not quite serious with that. Our grandmother and grandfather, they would have taken that and run them out of town. But you know what? Maybe they're just a little extreme. We're just going to stay right here. We're comfortable. We've kind of gotten tired. Our priorities are different. The urgency is gone. Maybe we don't know if God can do that. Maybe we're just too busy. I have to work a lot of overtime. Maybe my donkey is sick and I can't really go do all that. I'm going to put that off till next week. It's too expensive. It's too difficult. Never mind. And they become a functional generation. They just stop short of complete obedience. They come from the conquering generation that follows Lord in great faith. That baton is handed to a functional generation and they just get it to comfortable, but they don't finish and they don't experience what God has for them because they've just gotten it to the point where it's just about right. But then notice what happens in verse 11. Then the sons of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. Isn't that crazy? Within 3 generations, we go from a conquering generation to a functioning generation to a rebellious generation. Within 3 generations, we go from a group of people that conquered a whole area the size of California. They handed it off, not yet completed because they got old and died. They give it to their kids and their grandchildren, and they get it to the place where it's functional. And then that next generation, they just flat out rebel. Do you see a digression going on here? It'd be kind of like being a passionate UT fan and having a grandson who loves the Aggies. How does that happen, Ozzy? How does that happen? I don't know how that would happen, Craig. What's going on? Or being a Tech fan and all of a sudden cheering for Cincinnati. How does that happen? You can't cheer for that guy. How does that happen? How does that happen? Conquering generation gives it to a generation that's comfortable, functional, and then gives birth to a rebellious generation. And notice how they do this. They forsook the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt, and followed other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were around them. They bowed themselves down to them. Thus they provoked the Lord to anger. And then he repeats it. So they forsook the Lord and served Baal and Ashtaroth. And then the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he gave them into the hands of the plunderers who plundered them. With their plunderers, they would plunder. He sold them into the hands of the enemies around them, so that they could no longer stand before their enemies. Wherever they went, the hand of the Lord was against them for evil. In verse 15. And as the Lord had spoken, as the Lord had sworn to them, so that they were severely distressed. Then the Lord raised up judges who delivered them, in verse 16, from the hands of those who plundered them. And yet, even then, even after they were delivered, they did not listen to their judges, for they played the harlot after other gods and bowed themselves down to them. They turned aside quickly from the way in which their fathers had walked in obeying the commandments of the Lord. They did not do as their fathers did. What a tragedy. This is one of the most discouraging books, but you can see how it can happen to us just as easily. Where you have a wonderfully passionate grandfather who gives birth and raises a son who's not as passionate, who then raises a son who has no idea how that happened, has no clue, and it just progresses downward. It's gravity in a spiritual sense. It's gravity, and it happens very easily in our spiritual lives. It just sucks us down, down, and down. And you would think, as you read through this book, if you had the inkling of an idea that you could lose your salvation, if you had the thought in your mind that perhaps God would abandon one who rebelled against him, you can't read the book of Judges and conclude that. In fact, the book of Judges to me is one of the strongest supports of God's promise being kept by him. Because look what happens in verse 18. When the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge and delivered them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved to pity by their groaning because of those who oppressed and afflicted them. So you read that and you see that God does not abandon those who rebel. Aren't you glad? Isn't that good? Anybody ever had a season of rebellion? God does not abandon those who rebel. He brings them back to himself. And when you read the book of Judges on that cycle, it goes back and forth, but God never throws in the towel. In fact, if you could lose your salvation, if that was even possible, you wouldn't get out of the book of Judges. God would have walked away from the nation of Israel after Abraham, after Isaac, especially after Jacob. But he doesn't. He remains faithful and brings his children back to himself. And that's what happens in the book of Judges over and over again. God brings them back to obedience and brings them back. He sends great men, some great women to bring them back to the Lord so that they might experience the full blessings of the Lord. But it kept going over and over and over again. They continued to rebel. And so I've been reading this. Woohoo! It's a great thing to get up in the morning to read. I'm going to read the rebellion of the nation of Israel. How does it apply to us? Well, you can see this, and yeah, well, that looks obvious. One generation, they're the conquering generation, then you have the functional generation, and then you have the rebellious generation. How do we avoid that? Because I'm raising children. I look past me and I see Carson and I see Brooke, and eventually, a long time from now, I see grandkids on this side. But I look this way and I see my mom and my dad. I see my grandpa and grandma on both sides going this way. And there's this chain that is connected. I'm right here in the middle between. And I'm thinking, how do I connect the chain for that next generation, for mine? How do I connect that? And I think one word keeps popping to my mind because it comes back in verse 10. It says, and they did not know the Lord. They didn't know. They might be able to plead ignorance. I don't know how they can get away with that. I think that's a lousy case to make. They didn't know. And so I have to, as in where I'm at right now and applying this to my life, and you can apply it to yours as well, I have to remember to remind them what God has done. As a parent, as a pastor, as a husband, I have to remember God's faithfulness and tell my children what God was like and what God did. I can't control their behavior. Eventually, they'll be able to do what they want to do. Right now, I lock them in a seat. In fact, yesterday I was at the airport. I had like 2 hours to kill, and I've never seen this before. It looked like a great idea. Wish I had thought of it. But the mother, rather than taking the baby, or this boy, he looked like 2 years old, maybe 3, rather than take him out of the car seat, she bought a dolly and took the car seat out of the car and then locked the dolly on and pulled him through the airport. I thought, that's brilliant. And he's screaming and fighting and he's yelling. He wants out of it because he wants to run, right? She said, no. I'm not going to take you out of the car seat. I'm going to take the car out of the car seat and we're going to walk through the airport like that. I thought, wish I had thought of that. I think she went to jail. I think there was a security officer. But how do we raise kids that can do or remember what God has done? The only way we can do that is if you remember what God has done. Take a moment in the next day or two and just look back on 2012. What did God do this year? Maybe you need to write it down. Don't make a resolution. Just write down, what has God done? And I can look at some of you, and you've invited me into your life, and I can remember the moments in your life when God was doing something and you shared it with me, and I can look at you and go, I remember that. It's awesome. Remember what God has done. Write that down. And remember that in your own heart. Allow that to encourage your faith. And then remember to tell your children what God did. And they might be of the age right now to where they will actually remember that moment. I remember moments growing up and my dad shared with us some of the stressors that he was going through, and it shaped my faith in great ways. I remember those stories. And if your kids are old enough, tell them what it was like and what God did, because they don't know. They live in their own little world. You've tried to invade that world. It's hard to get into. They live in that little world. But if you can just step in there and say, this is what God did in a quiet moment, explain to them how God has worked in your life. So don't just remember for your sake. Remember for theirs. Tell them what happened and what God did. Tell them Remind them of your faith journey. Remind them of the things that God did for you. Remember, and then remember to tell them exactly what happened. But then the last one is to remember to act on that. It's one thing to remember. I remember where the YMCA is. So what? I have to remember to act on that memory and go there. I remember how to do this. I remember where the trash goes. When the trash can's full, I remember where that goes. Does it matter? Does my memory help me there? No. Unless you actually act upon that memory, it's really just nostalgia. It doesn't really mean a lot. Remember to tell them, and then act on that memory. Do something now. Do something about it. I read an article several years ago about CEOs. And the article was just trying to describe CEOs who were successful and CEOs who failed. It was stunning. Why does this CEO work and this CEO fail? What's the difference? Is it their education? Is it their business plan? Is it the economy that they're working in? Is it the product they're trying to manufacture and spin? What really makes the difference here? You want to know what the difference was? The only difference was one CEO actually acted on the plan. The other one, he didn't. Because a business plan on a desk does nothing unless you actually do it. Remembering is exciting, it's inspiring, but if it doesn't spur you on to action, then it's really just nostalgia and it doesn't change anything. Act on that memory. Do something about it so that your grandkids, and maybe even your great-grandkids, will benefit and grow over time. Odds are you worked pretty hard to give your kids, grandkids, and spouses a nice Christmas gift. They might be wearing it today. I am. No one said anything. I'm wearing a new shirt. Isn't it great to get a new shirt? I like to get it out and don't put it through the wash yet. Just wear it when it's off. Anyway, tangent. You get something that's new. It smells new. You feel new, although you're not. It's just a different feeling. I remember the moments when it was my brothers and I who walked into that living room and saw the presents. I got to experience that this year with Carson and Brooke, because now Carson's old enough to actually know what's happening. I remember watching my dad watch all of that happen. I remember watching him or walking down the stairs in our house and peeking around and looking down to see the tree that's been lit up. And I remember him upstairs and my mom upstairs fake sleeping because they just went to bed actually, and so they're just now going to sleep. My dad probably had slept all night because he didn't wrap the gifts. My mom did. And so I can remember going down there and seeing all those presents and getting excited about it, and then walking down there and going, wow, look at all of this. This is great. How exciting is this? Woohoo! And then we would play games and have a great, great Christmas day. But I don't really have any of those gifts left. I don't have them. But I do have the stories that my dad passed on to me in faith. The Christmas gifts that you just got, you probably won't have them 20 years from now. Probably not. If you're still wearing it 20 years from now, you've done pretty well. I think, that's impressive. But odds are you're not going to have it. But what your kids will have 20 years from now is the memory of the stories of God's faithfulness. And I've done enough funerals to know that those memories are the most powerful. No one comes to a funeral and says, my dad bought me this BB gun. No one comes to the funeral and says, yeah, look at this bike my dad bought me when I was... No one does that. I've sat over there or I've stood up here as son or daughter, have retold stories of parents' faith and how it's changed their lives. Mom and Dad, you and I can stress for weeks and days on end of what we're going to get our kids for Christmas or their birthday to make it special. And you should, that's fun. But the most important thing is to remember to tell them what God has done in your life so they can avoid some of the mistakes. And students, the most important thing you can do, don't get obsessed about the new gadget, the new thing you work with your thumbs so you can disappear into a new world, the B headphones. I saw a bunch of guys walking around with those big B headphones. I thought everything was supposed to get smaller. Now they're getting bigger. There's dudes walking around, he's got these big things, like Princess Leia walking through this. Do y'all know who Princess Leia is? Princess Leia. Okay. They're walking through there with these big things. But those will be outdated in a year. They'll be gone. You won't even use those anymore. They're coming out with a smartwatch now. It's going to control everything. You'll be able to go open your garage door. I mean, it's going to be incredible. But the things that they're going to remember for the rest of their lives, the stories you tell how God worked in yours. Pass it along. And students, when you hear those stories, soak it in, because you're going to need the story. There's going to come a day when that baton is going to get passed to you, and you're going to say, well, what did Dad do? What did Mom do? They did the same thing Grandpa did. I'm going to do the same thing they did. And those things transcend technology. They transcend gifts, presents, anything that comes out, because those are the stories of faith. And if you're looking for a place to read in your scriptures, read Judges, and you'll see how they just kept forgetting and forgetting in this cycle of despair. How do we break that? Remember to tell, and then remember to act upon that memory, so that the Lord can work in your life. It's the time of the year to commit to something. Consider committing to memory what God has done for you. Remember what the Lord has done. Remember to follow Him. Remember to tell your children why and how and what God has done for you as you've remembered.